When I pulled into Raymond B. Winter State Park, I expected silence. That's why I'd come. After the sleepless nights, the nightmares, the relentless guilt that had followed me since the fire, I needed solitude. Nothing but the hum of my RV and the whisper of the trees. What I didn't expect was Aaron. His car was already parked beside my spot, his loud grin and overbearing presence filling the space before I even stepped out. "Logan," he called, arms spread wide like this was some kind of reunion. "You didn't think I'd let you have all the fun out here, did you?" I froze, the irritation bubbling immediately. "What are you doing here, Aaron?" "Camping," he said with a laugh, slapping my shoulder. "Thought we could catch up. It's been, 5 years?" Longer, I wanted to say. Not long enough. But Aaron wasn't the kind of guy you could turn away without a scene. He'd plopped himself into my weekend without asking, and I knew he'd wedge himself into everything else too. By the time we set up camp, the sun was low, and the forest was awash in burnt orange light. I'd chosen a spot deep in the park, near the base of a ridge, far from the more popular trails. Isolation had been the point. "Not bad, Logan," Aaron said, dragging a cooler from his trunk. "Way out here, though? You trying to find Bigfoot?" I didn't answer, focused on setting up the RV. As I worked, I noticed Aaron flipping through something, a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "What's that?" He grinned, holding it up. "Found it in your glove box. Looks like some kind of treasure map." I frowned, stepping closer. It was a crude, hand-drawn map of the park. At its center, marked with a dark circle, was a spot labeled the Devil's Clearing. "Where'd that come from?" I asked, though the question felt pointless. I'd never seen it before. "Don't know, but it's creepy. Devil's Clearing. Sounds like an adventure." "Sounds like something to avoid," I muttered, snatching the map from his hand. That night, I woke to whispers. At first, I thought it was Aaron muttering in his sleep. But as I lay there, listening, the sound grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from inside the RV. It was outside, in the trees. I sat up, heart pounding. The whispers weren't in any language I recognized, but they seemed purposeful, like voices threading through the leaves. "Logan." The voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs. My name. I shot to my feet, grabbing a flashlight. I swung the beam out into the darkness, but the forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. "Logan?" This time it was Aaron's voice, and it came from the opposite direction of his sleeping bag. I hesitated. Aaron hadn't left the RV. I was sure of it. But before I could move, the sound stopped, the forest falling into silence so complete it made my ears ring. The next morning, Aaron was up early, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, holding up the map again. "I found it." "Found what?" "The clearing. It's real. There's a trail that leads right to it." I stared at him, unease prickling my skin. "And you want to go there?" He grinned. "Don't tell me you're scared, Logan. It's probably just some old legend, a spot where teenagers go to drink beer and tell ghost stories. Come on, it'll be fun." I didn't answer. Something about the map, about the whispers, about the way the forest felt heavier this morning, it all made my chest tighten. "I'm not going," I said finally. Aaron shrugged. "Suit yourself. I'll check it out on my own." Aaron didn't come back for hours. By mid-afternoon, I was pacing the campsite, debating whether to go after him. Part of me wanted to let him wander. He'd invited himself on this trip after all, but the guilt gnawed at me. That's when I met Beth. She appeared from the trail, a park ranger with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and a wary look in her eyes. "You're Logan?" she asked, glancing at the RV. I nodded. "How do you—" "Your friend mentioned you. Aaron, right? He said he was looking for something out here. Clearing." My stomach dropped. "He told you about that?" She nodded, stepping closer. "Listen, I don't know how much you know, but the Devil's Clearing isn't a place you want to visit. People go missing in this park sometimes. Most of the time we find them. But not always." "Missing?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She glanced at the trees, her expression darkening. "Stay close to camp, and if your friend comes back, tell him to forget the clearing." By dusk, Aaron returned. He stumbled into the clearing, grinning like a kid who'd found a hidden stash of candy. But his grin was off, too wide, too forced. "You should have come, Logan," he said, his voice too loud. "It's amazing. The stories are real. The clearing, the symbols, all of it." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my stomach knotting. He held up the map, his hands trembling. "There's something there. Someone. He spoke to me." I stared at him, dread pooling in my chest. "What do you mean, someone?" Aaron leaned closer, his eyes wild. "The Shadow Man. He offered me a deal. Money, power, everything I've ever wanted. I just have to give him something." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "What did he ask for?" I whispered. Aaron didn't answer. That night, the whispers returned, louder than before. This time, they weren't just in the trees. They were inside the RV, circling me like vultures. "Logan!" The voice was Aaron's, but when I turned, he was still in his bunk, his breathing deep and steady. I lay awake, the weight of the forest pressing down on me until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the map and headed for the clearing. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The closer I got, the colder it became, until my breath fogged in the dim moonlight. When I stepped into the clearing, the world fell silent. The ground was blackened, the trees charred as if a fire had swept through long ago. At its center stood a figure, a man-shaped void, darker than the night around it. "Logan," the Shadow Man said, his voice like ash. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't move. "I can take it away," he whispered, stepping closer. "The guilt, the pain. You can be free." Images flashed before me. The fire, the people I couldn't save, the weight I'd carried for years. For a moment, I wanted to say yes. "No!" Aaron's voice cut through the air. He stumbled into the clearing, his face twisted in desperation. "The deal's with me. I brought him here." The Shadow Man turned to Aaron, his form shifting, growing darker. "A deal requires a price," he said. "Choose." Aaron's eyes darted to me. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. But he did. "Take him." The Shadow Man surged toward me, his darkness consuming the clearing. But before he could touch me, a torch flared to life. Beth stepped into the clearing, chanting words I didn't understand. The flames licked higher and the Shadow Man recoiled, his form rippling. "Leave!" she shouted, thrusting the torch toward him. The ground beneath us began to crack, the earth splitting open as the clearing trembled. Aaron screamed, stumbling backward into one of the fissures. His cry was swallowed by the darkness. "Run!" Beth yelled, grabbing my arm. We sprinted from the clearing as the ground gave way, the whispers rising into a deafening roar. When we reached the RV, the forest was still again, the clearing gone. Beth looked at me, her face pale but resolute. "It's over," she said, but I wasn't so sure. The Shadow Man's whispers still echoed in my ears, a reminder that some deals don't die so easily. As I drove away from Raymond B. Winter State Park, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw Aaron standing at the edge of the trees, his face a shadow, his grin too wide. The first thing I noticed about Ricketts Glen was how alive it felt. Too alive. The forest seemed to pulse with something I couldn't quite place, a presence lurking in the shadows of the towering trees. I told myself it was just my nerves. This trip was supposed to bring Ethan and me closer together, not freak me out before we even unpacked. Ethan wasn't making it easy. My 14-year-old son sat slouched in the passenger seat, scrolling on his phone, the soft glow lighting his scowl. "Look at this place, Ethan," I said, gesturing toward the trees as we pulled into the gravel campsite near Lake Jean. "Isn't it beautiful?" "Sure, Mom," he muttered, not looking up. I swallowed the irritation bubbling in my chest. This trip was supposed to fix things between us, to show him I was still his mom, even after the divorce. But the space between us had grown so vast I didn't know how to bridge it. After we parked, I spent half an hour fiddling with the RV's water pump, cursing under my breath while Ethan leaned against a tree, scrolling on his phone. "It's not gonna fix itself," I snapped, slamming the toolbox shut. Ethan rolled his eyes and wandered off toward the lake. I considered calling after him, but I let him go. Maybe he'd calm down with some space. Maybe I would too. Later that evening, the forest grew eerily quiet. The cicadas, the rustle of leaves, even the hum of the distant road. All of it faded until the only sound was the crackle of our small campfire. Ethan sat across from me, poking the fire with a stick. "Did you know people go missing here?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. "What?" "Yeah, I read about it. Back in the 1930s, a whole family disappeared. No bodies, nothing. Some people think they drowned in the lake, others think it's haunted." "That's just a story," I said, forcing a smile. "Don't let it get to you." Ethan shrugged but didn't seem convinced. He was fascinated by ghost stories, the darker the better, and I worried he'd spend this trip chasing shadows instead of spending time with me. The first sign something wasn't right came the next morning. We were walking near the lake, the water perfectly still under a blanket of mist. Ethan, as usual, was a few paces ahead of me, his attention flitting between the trail and his phone. That's when he froze. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp, "come look at this." He pointed to a tree near the shore. Wedged into the bark was a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It showed a family of 5, a man, a woman, and 3 children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The youngest girl couldn't have been more than 8. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I stared at the picture. "Probably some hiker's idea of a joke," I said, but my stomach churned. Ethan slipped the photo into his pocket. "Cool," he muttered, walking off before I could stop him. By the afternoon, I was more than ready to pack up and leave. The water pump still wasn't working, and my attempts to reconnect with Ethan were failing miserably. Every time I tried to talk to him, he shut me out with one-word answers or sarcastic remarks. Then we met Connor. He pulled up to the campsite next to ours in an older RV, stepping out with a friendly wave. Connor was in his late 30s, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet intensity that made him seem older. When I mentioned the water pump, he offered to take a look. I didn't miss the way his eyes lingered on Ethan, as if searching for something. "You two should stay away from the lake after dark," he said casually, wiping grease off his hands. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated. "This place has a reputation. People hear things, see things. Just stay close to the campsite." That night, the lights appeared. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, while Ethan lay in the RV, headphones on. A flicker caught my eye. A faint glow, like a lantern, moving across the water. Then another and another, until a dozen lights bobbed above the surface, swaying in rhythm. I stood, heart pounding. "Ethan?" I called, but he didn't respond. The lights drew closer to the shore, and I thought I heard laughter, soft, childlike, echoing through the mist. I took a step forward, my breath hitching, when a hand grabbed my arm. "Don't," Connor said, his voice low. "They're not real." The next day, Ethan was different. He seemed lighter, less moody. I was relieved until I saw who he was talking to. It was a little girl, no more than 8, sitting with him by the lake. Her hair was damp, her pale skin almost translucent in the morning light. She smiled shyly at me, clutching a worn doll in her hands. "This is Isabel," Ethan said. "She's camping with her family." I looked around, but the lake was empty. "Where are they?" I asked. "They're nearby," Isabel said softly. Her voice sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, Ethan became obsessed with Isabel. He spent every waking moment by the lake, talking to her, playing games I couldn't see. When I tried to ask him about her family, he brushed me off, his tone distant. Connor pulled me aside that afternoon. "She's not real," he said bluntly. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "She's part of it. The lake, the lights, the stories, it's all connected. The family that disappeared, they're still here, and they want replacements." I laughed, more out of disbelief than humor. "You're saying my son is talking to a ghost?" Connor's expression didn't change. "I lost my daughter to this place. I've been searching for her ever since. Don't let it take him, too." That night, Ethan went missing. I woke to an empty RV, the door swinging open in the cold wind. Panicked, I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the lake, screaming his name. The lights were there, glowing brighter than ever, dancing across the water. And standing at the shore, holding Isabel's hand, was Ethan. "Ethan!" I cried, rushing toward him. He turned to me, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. "She needs me, Mom. She's all alone." "No, she's not," I shouted, grabbing his arm. Isabel's grip tightened on his hand, her eyes dark and hollow. Behind her, shapes began to emerge from the water. Tall, shadowy figures, their faces blurred but their intent unmistakable. "Let him go," I screamed at Isabel. "Take me instead." For a moment, everything froze. Isabel looked up at me, her expression conflicted, as if she were still just a little girl caught in something she didn't understand. Then, slowly, she released Ethan's hand. Connor appeared out of nowhere, pulling Ethan away as the figures surged forward. He shoved us back toward the forest, shouting over his shoulder, "Go! Don't stop!" We didn't stop running until we reached the RV. By the time I turned back, Connor was gone. The next morning, I found a photo tucked under the windshield wiper. It was sepia-toned, showing Connor with a little girl on his lap. The girl looked just like Isabel. Ethan didn't say much after that. He seemed tired, quieter, but he stayed close to me for the rest of the trip. As we drove away from Ricketts Glen, I caught one last glimpse of the lake in the rearview mirror. Isabel stood on the shore, her doll in her hands, watching us leave. I knew I'd never see Connor or her again. But sometimes when the world is too quiet, I hear the laughter, soft and distant, like the lake hasn't let us go. When Maggie first suggested Hemlock Hollow for our weekend trip, I thought she'd lost her mind. It wasn't just the stories, the disappearances, the whispers of curses, or the supposed witch that haunted the place. It was the way people talked about it, with a palpable fear. Locals avoided it like the plague, as if the forest itself was alive. But Maggie had that look in her eye, the one that told me nothing would stop her. "It's for the article," she said. "Think of the clicks, the forgotten hauntings of Pennsylvania. This could put me on the map." Josh, her boyfriend, chimed in, "Always the tech bro. And I've got my drone and all my gear. We'll be fine. It's just a story." I glanced at Derek, my boyfriend, hoping for backup. He just shrugged, more interested in tuning up the RV than talking sense into Maggie. By the time we parked at Hemlock Hollow late Friday afternoon, the air already felt different. Heavy, like the forest was watching. The first sign of trouble came almost immediately. The RV's generator sputtered and died just as we finished setting up. "Great," Derek muttered, kicking the wheel. "Guess we're roughing it for real." Josh pulled out his gadgets, eager to show off, but his drone wouldn't calibrate, and his GPS flickered uselessly. "Weird," he muttered, fiddling with the controls. "Maybe the trees are messing with the signal." "It's a sign," I said, half joking, but Maggie shot me a look, the kind that said she wasn't turning back. By nightfall, the forest had grown unnaturally silent. Not a single cricket chirped. The fire crackled, its warmth failing to chase away the chill that settled in my bones. That's when we found the graves. Maggie was the first to spot them, shallow depressions in the earth just beyond the firelight. "Are those—" She trailed off, kneeling to inspect one. "Just sinkholes," Derek said, but his voice wavered. I knew him well enough to hear the doubt. Laura, me, wasn't so sure. "These aren't natural," I whispered. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea crashing over me. I could almost feel something radiating from the ground, a lingering pain that made my skin crawl. We didn't linger long after that. I woke in the middle of the night to whispers. At first, I thought it was Derek, but when I turned, I saw him fast asleep. The sound was faint, coming from outside the RV. Soft, sing-song murmurs, like a lullaby just out of earshot. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, shaking him awake. He grumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The whispers stopped. I tried to shake off the feeling, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, we hiked deeper into the forest, Maggie leading the charge with her camera. The trees loomed tall, their branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the sun. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get. That's when we saw them. Figures, shadowy shapes darting between the trees. Too fast to be human, too large to be animals. "Did you see that?" I asked, gripping Derek's arm. "It's nothing," he said, though his hand hovered near his hunting knife. But Maggie was already chasing after them, camera in hand. "Wait," she called, disappearing into the trees. "Maggie, stop!" Josh shouted, running after her. Derek and I followed, but the forest felt like it was shifting around us, the trees growing thicker, the path twisting in ways that made no sense. When we finally caught up, Maggie stood frozen in front of an old, gnarled tree. Beneath it lay an altar of stones, covered in strange symbols etched deep into their surfaces. Bones littered the ground. Animal, I hoped. "Is this part of the story?" Josh asked, his voice shaking. "I don't think this is the kind of story we want to be part of," I muttered. That night, the fire barely seemed to hold back the darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling us like predators. And then they came closer. I saw them first, shadowy figures just beyond the firelight. They moved unnaturally, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, like marionettes with broken strings. "Maggie," I whispered, pointing. The firelight flickered, and the shadows stepped closer. "They're not real," Derek said, though he didn't sound convinced. Josh grabbed his drone controller, frantically trying to get it to work. But as he fiddled with it, I realized something horrifying. The shadows were mimicking us. One of them tilted its head the way Maggie had earlier. Another shifted its stance, mirroring Josh's movements. "What do they want?" Maggie whispered, clutching her camera like a talisman. By the next morning, it was clear something was wrong with me. I woke to find Derek staring at me, his face pale. "Laura, you were talking in your sleep, in some language I didn't understand." I didn't remember dreaming, but I felt wrong. Heavy, like something was pressing on my chest. As the day wore on, it got worse. My thoughts felt muddled, my body sluggish. I caught glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces. My eyes looked darker, sunken. And the whispers, they weren't just at night anymore. They were in my head. Maggie tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "She's possessed," Derek said bluntly, earning a glare from Maggie. "We need to do something before it gets worse." We tried everything. Josh rigged makeshift traps around the camp while Maggie scoured her notes for anything about breaking curses. Derek grudgingly agreed to help me perform a ritual using the charms I'd brought. It felt silly, but I was desperate. As we lit the candles and chanted, the shadows closed in, their forms growing clearer. I could see their faces now, distorted versions of our own. And then I heard my voice among the whispers. "Help me," it begged, but I knew it wasn't me. By the time night fell, it was clear we were out of options. The shadows attacked, their forms no longer just illusions. Derek fought them off with a torch, but their touch left burns on his skin, and their mimicry became more cruel. "Maggie," one of them called in my voice, "please don't leave me." Maggie hesitated, and one of the shadows lunged, slashing her arm. "We have to end this," Derek said, grabbing his knife. "Burn the altar." "But what about Laura?" Maggie asked, tears streaming down her face. Derek looked at me, then back at the forest. "If we don't, we're all dead." In the end, it was Derek who made the sacrifice. He fought off the shadows long enough for Maggie and Josh to drag me to the RV. As we ran, the firelight from the altar flared, and the shadows screamed, a sound that echoed in my ears long after we escaped. We never went back for Derek. By the time the authorities searched the area, there was no sign of him or the altar. Maggie never wrote the article. I don't think any of us could explain what happened, even if we tried. But sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear the whispers, and I know Hemlock Hollow hasn't forgotten us. Gettysburg was supposed to be our big break. I'd spent months planning the trip, studying every legend tied to Devil's Den, and preparing equipment for what I hoped would be the most compelling episode yet for my YouTube channel. The idea was simple: debunk the myths surrounding one of the most haunted battlefields in America. Ghosts, whispers, shadow figures — it was all just exaggerated folklore, right? Emma and Nate weren't so sure. They'd agreed to come along for the ride, though for different reasons. Emma had always been my partner in crime, quick-witted and braver than me on most days. Nate, on the other hand, was more of a tag-along, a guy we'd met through mutual friends. He didn't share my skepticism and was already nervous as we pulled the RV into the small private plot of land just off the battlefield. "This place gives me the creeps," Nate said, glancing out the window at the darkening woods. "It's history," I replied, "not horror." "You keep telling yourself that," Emma muttered as she shouldered her backpack. "Let's just set up and get it over with." By the time we reached Devil's Den, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks. The place felt different than I expected. There was a heaviness in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. I chalked it up to the weight of history. Thousands of soldiers had fought and died here. Of course, it felt somber. We started filming, moving between the massive boulders as I narrated the stories tied to the site. Emma climbed one of the rocks, her silhouette framed against the fading light. "Do you really think people hear whispers here?" she asked, her voice echoing. "It's just wind through the rocks," I said, gesturing for Nate to pan the camera over the formations. "People love to scare themselves." Emma froze mid-step, her head tilting slightly. "Funny. I thought I just heard one." Nate lowered the camera. "Heard what?" "A whisper," she said, hopping down from the rock. "Right in my ear." "Don't start," I warned. "We've got enough to film without fake scares." Emma shot me a glare but didn't argue. As we packed up for the night, I noticed her glance over her shoulder more than once. The first sign that something was wrong came back at the RV. As we reviewed the footage, the camera glitched whenever it pointed toward certain parts of the battlefield. Static, distorted images, and bursts of audio that sounded like faint whispers ruined several clips. Nate leaned closer to the screen, his face pale. "That's not normal." "It's a malfunction," I said, though my voice wavered. "Old equipment in a humid environment." "Humid environment my ass," Emma said, crossing her arms. "What's your excuse for the smell?" I paused. The air inside the RV was thick with a sickly sweet odor, like burning gunpowder mixed with rotten meat. I checked the stove, the fridge, even the wiring, but nothing seemed out of place. "Just sulfur from the rocks," I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. Emma didn't look convinced. Neither did Nate. The whispers started again that night. I woke to the sound of my name being called, soft and insistent. "Sam, come outside." At first, I thought it was Emma. Then I realized the voice wasn't quite right. It was too smooth, too calm. When I looked across the RV, she was still asleep, her breathing steady. Nate snored lightly from his bunk. "Sam," the voice called again, this time from outside. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The woods were silent, unnaturally so, and the beam of light barely penetrated the darkness. I walked a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding. "Sam?" the voice whispered from the trees. It sounded closer now, more insistent. I froze. A shadow moved just out of reach of the light, a tall, thin figure that seemed to blend into the night. My breath caught in my throat as the flashlight flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. When the beam returned, the shadow was gone. I bolted back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd seen. Emma was already in a mood, muttering about weird vibes and how the smell had gotten worse. Nate, pale and jittery, said he'd heard footsteps circling the RV in the middle of the night. "It's just your imagination," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We headed back to Devil's Den for more filming, determined to get something usable. While walking among the rocks, Nate tripped over something in the dirt. He dug it out, a rusted bullet, heavy and jagged. "Must be a Civil War relic," I said, holding it up to the light. "Put it back," Emma said immediately. "It's just a bullet," I said, slipping it into my pocket. "Relax." She didn't argue, but I caught her eyeing me with a mix of worry and anger. As we continued filming, the atmosphere grew heavier. Emma complained about feeling watched, and Nate kept glancing over his shoulder. At one point, he swore he saw a shadow dart between the rocks, but when we checked, there was nothing there. Then the whispers came again. "Sam?" a voice called, faint but distinct. "Help me." I turned sharply, shining my flashlight toward the source. The beam landed on Emma, who was standing a few feet away. "What?" she asked, startled. "You called me," I said, her brow furrowed. "No, I didn't." Before I could respond, Nate let out a sharp cry, clutching his arm. Deep scratches ran down his forearm, fresh and bleeding. "What happened?" Emma asked, grabbing his arm to inspect the wounds. "Something grabbed me," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I swear, something grabbed me." Back at the RV, tensions boiled over. "This isn't normal," Emma said, pacing the small space. "The whispers, the shadows, the scratches. Something's wrong here." "It's just our nerves," I insisted, though my confidence was fading fast. The whispers had followed us back, faint and constant, like a distant radio station we couldn't turn off. Nate sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. "We need to leave?" "We can't," I said. "Not until we figure out what's happening." Emma rounded on me. "What's happening is we're being hunted by something, and you're too stubborn to admit it." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the RV shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the air, louder than the whispers. "Leave." Emma pieced it together first, flipping through the notes she'd taken on local lore. "The Devil's Whisper," she said, her voice tight. "It's not just a legend. It's a demon or something like it. They say it's drawn to suffering, to bloodshed." "What does it want?" Nate asked, his voice trembling. "To divide us, to scare us, to drive us to, I don't know, madness? Death?" She looked at me. "And that bullet you picked up? You brought it right to us." I hesitated, the weight of the bullet suddenly unbearable in my pocket. "So, how do we stop it?" "We give it back," she said. "And we apologize." That night, we returned to the rocks, the bullet clutched in my hand. The whispers grew louder with each step, rising to a deafening crescendo as we reached the spot where Nate had found it. Shadows moved among the boulders, closing in around us. "Do it!" Emma urged, her voice shaking. I knelt, placing the bullet in the dirt. "We're sorry," I said, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "We didn't mean to disturb you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The shadows retreated, melting into the darkness. The air grew lighter, and the sickly sweet smell faded. "Is it over?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," Emma said, though she didn't sound convinced. We left Gettysburg the next morning, shaken but alive. The RV bore deep scratches on its walls, and Nate had scars on his arm that would never fade. Emma refused to talk about the trip, and Nate cut ties with us entirely. As for me, I uploaded what footage we had. Most of it was corrupted, but the final shot, a shaky, static-filled frame of Devil's Den, captured something I couldn't explain. A tall, shadowy figure standing among the rocks, watching us. And in the final seconds of audio, just before the video cut out, a faint voice whispered, "I'll see you again." When Sarah suggested an RV camping trip to the Laurel Highlands, I was skeptical. Not because I didn't like camping. I'd spent my fair share of weekends fishing and hiking, but because it seemed unnecessary. We didn't need a family bonding retreat. We were fine. Sure, Ellie had been quieter lately, and Lucas had been acting out at school, but they were kids. That's how kids are. Still, Sarah insisted. "We need this, Ethan," she'd said, her eyes a mix of hope and determination. So here we were, deep in the misty woods of western Pennsylvania, parked in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees and nothing else. The first day wasn't bad. We hiked to a nearby waterfall, had a picnic, and roasted marshmallows by the fire. Ellie, ever the introverted dreamer, sketched the trees in her journal while Lucas chased fireflies, his laughter echoing through the woods. Even I started to relax until Ellie found the clearing. "I think it's a fire pit," Ellie said, crouching near a circle of charred stones. We'd wandered off the trail near our campsite, the sunlight dimming under a thick canopy of leaves. The air here felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. Sarah joined her, frowning at the strange symbols carved into the surrounding trees. "It's old. Pioneer era, maybe." Lucas kicked at something half buried in the dirt. "What's this?" He pulled out a blackened, rusted cauldron, its sides crusted with soot and grime. "Don't touch that," Sarah snapped, startling all of us. "It could be dangerous." Lucas let go, but Ellie lingered, tracing her fingers along its rim. "It's kind of cool," she murmured, almost to herself. "Leave it," I said firmly, taking her hand. "Let's head back." That night, things got strange. The generator in the RV sputtered and died just as we were finishing dinner. "Probably the spark plug," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. But when I stepped outside, the light flickered and went out. "Cheap batteries," I grumbled, heading back in. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale. "Do you smell that?" The air inside was thick with the acrid scent of smoke. I checked the stove, the fire pit, even the wiring, but there was no source. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Lucas woke up crying around midnight. "She's singing to me," he said, clutching his blanket. "Who?" Sarah asked, stroking his hair. "The lady in the woods," he whimpered. She said she wants Ellie. The next morning, Sarah found burn marks on the side of the RV. They were shaped like hands, large, clawed, and blackened as if seared into the metal. A bear? I suggested, though even I knew better. Sarah shook her head. No bear made these. Ellie didn't say much, but she seemed off. She kept glancing at the woods, her usual curiosity replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Fear? Fascination? We decided to hike out to find better reception and call for help. The trail seemed different, though. The trees closed in tighter, their branches twisted like skeletal arms. A thick mist rolled in, muffling every sound but our footsteps. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. The path was lined with scorch marks, the blackened grass still smoldering. Lucas clung to my leg. "I don't like this, Dad." "Stay close," I said, gripping his hand tighter. By the time we returned to the RV, Ellie was acting stranger than ever. She hummed to herself in a low, eerie tune, the same melody Lucas had described the night before. Sarah tried to talk to her, but Ellie just stared at her, her eyes distant and unblinking. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Sarah, but she was fast asleep. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out words. "Bring her to me," a voice hissed, low and crackling like fire. I shot up, grabbing the knife I'd kept by my bed. The whispers stopped, replaced by a faint flicker of light outside. Flames danced in the woods, moving in slow, deliberate circles. "We need to leave," Sarah said the next morning, her voice shaking. "I'm not arguing," I replied, throwing our things into bags. But when I turned the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered once, then died completely. "This isn't normal," Sarah muttered, staring at the claw marks on the dashboard. Ellie sat in the corner, her journal clutched to her chest. "We can't leave," she said softly. "What do you mean?" I asked. "She won't let us." Sarah pieced it together later that afternoon, flipping through an old journal she'd picked up at the park museum. It belonged to a pioneer, a man who'd written about a woman accused of witchcraft. The settlers had burned her alive in the clearing, cursing her name as she screamed. They thought her spirit would die with her body, but the journal ended with a chilling line: "The witch's fire still burns." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Ethan, we disturbed her grave. The cauldron, it was hers." "What do we do?" I asked, my throat dry. "We have to put her to rest," she said, her voice trembling. "The journal says her spirit is tied to the cauldron. If we return it to the spring and make an offering, it might break the curse." That night, the witch came for us. Flames erupted around the RV, circling it in a blazing inferno. The windows rattled as a shadowy figure moved outside, its outline distorted by heat. "She's here," Ellie whispered, her voice unnervingly calm. "Grab the cauldron," Sarah shouted, pulling Lucas close. I hoisted the heavy iron pot, its surface strangely warm, and we bolted into the woods. The flames followed us, the witch's silhouette appearing and disappearing among the trees. "She's getting closer," Lucas screamed, tears streaming down his face. The path to the spring was a blur of terror. The air grew colder, the flames hotter, and Ellie began murmuring in a voice that wasn't hers. "You can't stop me," she said, her lips barely moving. "Ellie, fight it," Sarah cried, shaking her. We reached the spring just as the flames began to close in. Sarah placed the cauldron in the water, her hands trembling. "We need an offering," she said, looking at me desperately. I emptied my pockets, a pocket knife, a lighter, and then my wedding ring. It felt like a punch to the gut, but I dropped it into the cauldron, whispering a silent apology. The flames roared one last time, then vanished. The air grew still, and the shadow disappeared. Ellie collapsed into Sarah's arms, her body limp but breathing. We made it out of the woods at dawn, battered and shaken but alive. The RV was a wreck, its sides scorched and clawed beyond repair. We abandoned it, hitching a ride to the nearest town. Ellie doesn't talk about what happened. Sometimes I catch her staring at the woods, her eyes distant, as if she's still listening to that song. And at night, I swear I see a flicker of fire in the distance, just beyond the trees. The witch's fire still burns, and I'll never go camping again. I never thought I'd regret taking a weekend off to relax, but as I sit here typing this, my hands still tremble, and I can't stop looking over my shoulder. If you don't believe what I'm about to tell you, fine. But know this, there are things out there, things older and hungrier than we can imagine. They don't care if you believe in them. They'll find you anyway. It all started with a road trip to the endless mountains in Sullivan County, Pennsylvania. My friends Mason, Brooke, and I wanted a break from the city grind, and the idea of camping deep in the forest sounded perfect. I'd planned the whole trip for my travel blog. The more remote the spot, the better for the story. World's End. State Park seemed too popular, so we chose a remote section further north. I should have listened when the locals warned us not to go that deep. They said the trails were poorly marked and that the wilderness there had a way of keeping people. The trouble started early. The GPS on the RV kept losing signal, and even my compass started spinning like it had a mind of its own. We passed the same moss-covered boulder 3 times before Brooke, always the overachiever, pulled out her paper map. "We're way off course," she said, her brow furrowed. "We should have turned back miles ago." "Nah," Mason said, kicking his feet up on the dashboard. "That's just the spirit of adventure, Brooke. You can't plan everything." I laughed, trying to keep the mood light. Relax, guys. This is what we came for. Getting lost is part of the fun. I wish I'd taken her side. We finally found a clearing by dusk, just big enough for the RV. Trees loomed over us, their branches tangled like skeletal hands against the twilight sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. We built a small fire, but the warmth didn't chase away the creeping chill. As the shadows lengthened, Brooke noticed the tracks. They were just outside the firelight's reach, pressed into the soft dirt. Massive prints, clawed and deeply embedded, circled the clearing like something had been watching us. "Bear?" I offered, though even I didn't believe it. Brooke crouched by the tracks, shaking her head. "Too big. And look, there's no trail. It's like it just appeared." Mason laughed nervously. "Cool, so we're being stalked by a bear ghost. I've seen this movie. Let's name it Barry." I rolled my eyes, but Brooke didn't look amused. "This isn't funny." Neither was the howling that started later. Long, low, and mournful, it echoed through the trees, louder than anything I'd heard before. "Wolves?" Mason said, sitting up straighter. "No wolves in Pennsylvania," Brooke shot back, her voice tight. We all listened, frozen. The sound shifted, warping into something that almost resembled a voice. Faint, but distinct. "Help!" it called, somewhere deep in the woods. "Help me!" Mason swore first, Did you hear that? Someone's out there." I shook my head. "No, it doesn't sound right. It's wrong." "Wrong?" Mason scoffed. "What are we supposed to do, let them die? I'm checking it out." "No," Brooke said sharply, grabbing his arm. "We stay here. If someone's out there, we'll call for help in the morning." "What help?" Mason snapped. "We've got no signal, no compass. We're the help." Before I could stop him, Mason grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the woods. The beam of light bobbed between the trees, growing smaller and smaller until it was gone. I cursed under my breath. Idiot. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The fire crackled, and every rustle in the forest made my skin crawl. Then we heard it. His voice. "Hey, guys, over here! I found—" The shout cut off suddenly, leaving the air dead silent. "Mason?" I called, panic rising in my chest. "Where are you?" Brooke gripped my arm. "Alex, something's wrong." Then Mason's voice came again, closer this time. "Guys, I'm fine. Just come here. You have to see this." Brooke shook her head, her face pale. "No, that's not him." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my throat dry. She swallowed hard. "It's copying him." We huddled by the fire, clutching knives we'd grabbed from the RV. The voice circled us, first Mason's, then mine, then Brooke's. Each time it called out, the tone was just a little off. Too smooth, too hollow, like a recording played back by someone who didn't understand emotion. Then we saw it. Just beyond the firelight, something moved between the trees. Its shape was wrong. Tall and thin, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The smell of rot filled the clearing. Brooke started muttering under her breath. Something about native legends she'd read. "The Wendigo," she whispered. "It's a spirit of hunger. It mimics voices, preys on fear." "Great," I hissed. "How do we stop it?" "We don't," she said, her voice trembling. "We survive." The Wendigo didn't rush us. It didn't need to. It circled the clearing for hours, its glowing eyes darting in and out of sight. The fire began to die, and with it, our nerve. When it reached the edge of the light, it didn't attack. Instead, it clawed at the RV, leaving deep gouges in the metal, like it was marking its prey. We barricaded ourselves inside, but the creature didn't leave. It pressed its face to the windows, hollow eyes staring in, its breath fogging the glass. Every few minutes it scraped the door with its claws, sending shivers down my spine. When dawn finally broke, the creature retreated, but the forest was no less hostile in the light. The tracks circled the RV, stopping at the door. Blood smears led into the woods. We found Mason stumbling back into the clearing, disoriented and shivering. He claimed he didn't remember anything after leaving the fire. We decided to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Brooke took out the map, her hands shaking. "We need to find the main trail and follow it on foot. If we stay here, it'll come back." We packed quickly, the sense of being watched never leaving us. As we hiked, the forest grew darker, the air colder. Mason stumbled more than once, his energy sapped. "I feel heavy," he said, his voice weak, "like it's pulling me." Brooke stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. "It's the blood." "What?" "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to the fresh cut on his arm. "It's drawn to blood. The Wendigo came for us that night. We'd barely set up a makeshift camp when its howls started again, closer than ever." Mason was the first to snap. "I can't take this," he shouted, running into the woods despite our protests. Brooke pulled out a bundle of sage from her bag. "We can do this," she said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I read about a ritual. We burn this, leave an offering, and beg for forgiveness." I nodded, not fully understanding but desperate for anything that might work. We lit the sage and placed what little food we had left in a circle, whispering apologies to whatever force we'd angered. The Wendigo's howls grew louder, but it didn't attack. When Mason returned, he was limping and pale, but alive. The creature had left him alone, as if respecting the ritual, but its presence lingered. As we finally stumbled back onto a marked trail, I glanced over my shoulder and saw it standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. We made it back to civilization, but nothing feels normal anymore. The RV was towed, its sides scarred with claw marks. Mason doesn't talk about what he saw, and Brooke won't go near the woods. And me? Every night I hear that voice, my own voice, calling from the darkness. It knows where I am, and I don't think it's finished with us yet. I always thought I could protect her. After everything I'd been through, every lesson life had beaten into me, I thought I'd learned how to keep my daughter safe. But standing in the shadows of Screaming Pines, I realized I'd been wrong. The trip was Nate's idea. "You need a break," he'd said, showing up out of the blue after 2 years of silence. He was always like that, drifting in and out of my life whenever it suited him. I wanted to tell him to leave, but Avery, my 10-year-old, lit up the moment she saw him. I caved. Against my better judgment, I let him tag along on the road trip I'd planned for just Avery and me. "It'll be good for her," I told myself. "Good for us." By the time we reached Screaming Pines campground, I was already regretting it. "This place is perfect," Nate announced, hopping out of the RV as soon as we parked. His wide grin faded as he took in the scene. The trees pressed in on all sides, their gnarled branches blotting out the sun. The air was still, too still. Not a single bird sang, and the absence of sound felt unnatural. Avery didn't seem to notice. "It's spooky," she said, grinning as she explored the campsite. "I like it." I frowned. "Let's not wander too far, okay?" Nate clapped me on the back, laughing. "Relax, Cassie, it's just trees. What's the worst that could happen?" The first night, I started to understand. Avery had gone to bed early, tired from the long drive, leaving Nate and me to sit by the fire. The silence gnawed at me, making every crack of the wood seem unnaturally loud. Nate, oblivious as always, was in the middle of some story about his latest adventures when it happened. A scream. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and agonized, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Nate nodded slowly, his usual bravado gone. "Yeah." A second scream followed, then a third. They didn't sound human, but they didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. "Coyotes, maybe?" Nate offered weakly. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. My gut told me this was something else. The next morning, I found the note. It was nailed to a tree near the RV, written on a weathered scrap of paper. The words were scrawled in uneven letters, almost like a child's handwriting. "Don't let her in." "Funny prank," Nate said, holding it up. "Someone's trying to freak us out." I didn't laugh. My instincts were screaming at me that this wasn't a joke. But Avery was watching, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity, so I forced a smile. "It's just a silly note," I said, taking it from Nate. I crumpled it and stuffed it into my pocket, hoping that would be the end of it. That afternoon, Avery saw her. We were walking back from a short hike when Avery stopped dead in her tracks. "Mom," she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "Do you see her?" I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the wind. "See who?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "The lady in white," she said. "She's standing right there." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at Nate, but he just shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "I don't see anything, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "She's crying," Avery insisted, her voice trembling. "She looks so sad." That night, the RV betrayed me. I'd just finished tucking Avery in when the lights began to flicker. A low hum filled the air like static from an old TV. Then the doors began to lock and unlock on their own, the mechanisms clicking in a maddening rhythm. Nate grabbed a flashlight, his face pale. "What the hell is going on?" Before I could answer, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and Avery's stuffed rabbit appeared on the table. The rabbit she'd been clutching when I put her to bed. "Avery!" I called, rushing to her bunk. She was gone. Panic surged through me. "Avery!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I threw open the RV door, but the darkness outside felt impenetrable, like a solid wall. My flashlight barely cut through it. "We'll find her," Nate said, his usual bravado replaced by quiet determination. He grabbed my arm. "Come on." The forest swallowed us as we stumbled through the trees, calling Avery's name. The air was heavy, and every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rasp of our breathing. Then we heard it. Crying. It was faint at first, but as we drew closer, it grew louder. Heart-wrenching sobs that made my chest ache. And, over it all, Avery's voice. "Mom, Uncle Nate?" I broke into a run, ignoring Nate's protests. The crying grew louder, the sound twisting into something almost inhuman. Then I saw her. Avery stood in a small clearing, her back to me, and next to her was a woman. Her figure was faint, almost translucent, and her face was hidden beneath a veil of long, dark hair. "Avery!" I shouted, but she didn't move. The woman turned toward me, her face pale and expressionless. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then she raised a hand and pointed to the trees behind me. "Don't let her take me," Avery whispered. Something moved in the shadows. I turned, and for the first time, I saw it. The creature was massive, its body a twisted amalgamation of shadow and bone. Its limbs were too long, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It let out a low, guttural growl, and the woman in white stepped between it and Avery. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the creature's growls. I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Avery's hand, I pulled her away, shouting for Nate to follow. The creature lunged, but the woman held it back, her translucent form flickering like a dying flame. We ran until my legs burned, until the RV appeared through the trees like a beacon. Nate fumbled with the keys, his hands shaken, and the engine sputtered to life just as the shadows closed in. We didn't stop driving until the sun rose, the light chasing away the darkness that had clung to us. Avery sat in the passenger seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She hadn't said a word since we'd escaped, and I didn't push her. I was too shaken myself. Nate broke the silence first. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's not just a legend." Avery finally looked up. "She wasn't bad," she said quietly. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "The lady," she said, "she was trying to help me. She didn't want him to get me." "Who's him?" Nate asked. Avery hesitated, then pointed out the window. "Him." I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. In the distance, just visible through the trees, stood a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. Watching. Waiting. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the gas. Whatever had happened at Screamin' Pines, I knew one thing for sure. We had gotten away, but we weren't safe. Not yet. Not as long as it was still out there. I didn't intend to pick up a hitchhiker. I wasn't the kind of person who did that anymore. Too many stories, too many risks, and, if I was honest, I liked my solitude. But when I saw her standing by the edge of the dirt road, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and desperation etched into her face, I stopped before I could think better of it. "Need a ride?" I asked through the rolled-down window of my RV. She hesitated, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. Up close, she looked younger than I'd thought. Mid to late 20s maybe, with dark hair and a weariness in her eyes that felt far too familiar. "I'm heading toward Shadow Valley," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "Are you going that way?" I almost laughed. No one went to Shadow Valley, not unless they were looking for something, or trying to lose themselves. "What's in Shadow Valley?" I asked instead. "My brother," she said simply. Her eyes held mine, and I could see the steel beneath her weariness. "He went missing there." Something about her tone struck a chord. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "I'm Sam," I said as she climbed in. She didn't reply, just nodded as she settled into the passenger seat. It wasn't until we were well down the road that she finally introduced herself. "Megan." Shadow Valley sat deep in Bald Eagle State Forest, an isolated expanse of wilderness in central Pennsylvania. I'd picked it as my destination for the same reasons I always chose places like this. It was remote, quiet, and easy to disappear into. After leaving my job as a park ranger, I'd taken to traveling solo, bouncing from one forest to another in my beat-up RV. Solitude had become my comfort. And my penance. The road into Shadow Valley was worse than I'd expected. Potholes jarred the RV with every turn, and the deeper we went, the more the world seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together to block out the sun. The air felt heavier, the kind of thick that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. "Do you know about the valley?" Megan asked suddenly. I glanced at her. She was staring out the window, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Not much," I admitted. "Just that it's quiet." She let out a dry laugh. "Quiet's one way to put it." The RV jolted as we hit another pothole, and the dashboard lights flickered. I frowned, tapping the gas. The engine stuttered but held. "You should know," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People don't come back from Shadow Valley. Not whole." Before I could ask what she meant, a figure appeared in the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the RV screeching to a halt. The figure, a man, older, with a wild tangle of gray hair, stood motionless in the middle of the road. He was barefoot, his clothes little more than rags, but his eyes were sharp, locked onto mine. I rolled down the window. "You okay?" He didn't answer, just stepped closer. Megan shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Maybe we should go," she muttered. Before I could respond, the man spoke. "You're heading into the valley," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. I nodded cautiously. "Yeah, why?" He stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "Turn back. Whatever you're looking for, it's not worth it." "Look, we're just—" Megan started, but the man cut her off. "The valley is hungry," he said. His gaze flicked to Megan. "It'll show you what you want. Make you think you found it. But it's a lie. Don't trust what you see. And for God's sake, don't answer the voices." With that, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving us in silence. By the time we reached the clearing I'd chosen for our campsite, the sun was low on the horizon. Megan stayed quiet as I set up, her earlier confidence replaced by a jittery unease. I couldn't blame her. The encounter with the old man had rattled me too, though I wasn't about to admit it. The night came quickly, wrapping the valley in a suffocating darkness. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed in on all sides. Even the fire I'd built seemed dimmer than it should have been, its light swallowed by the surrounding trees. "Tell me about your brother," I said, breaking the quiet. Megan hesitated, staring into the flames. "He came here 6 months ago," she said finally. "Said he needed to clear his head, but he never came back." "And you think he's still out there?" I asked. She nodded, but her expression was strained. I saw him." "What?" "In a dream," she said quickly as if embarrassed. "I know how it sounds, but I saw him, and he was here, calling for me. I had to come." I wanted to tell her it was ridiculous, but I didn't, because deep down I understood. The valley had a way of calling people. The first sign that something was wrong came just before dawn. I woke to find Megan standing at the edge of the clearing, her back to me. The fire had burned out, and the RV was dark, its engine ticking softly in the cold air. "Megan," I called. She didn't respond. I climbed out of the RV and approached her cautiously. "Megan, what are you doing?" She turned slowly, her face pale in the moonlight. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I frowned. "Hear what?" "The voices." Before I could answer, a sound cut through the silence, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. My stomach turned. "We need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. She resisted, her eyes wide and unfocused. "He's here," she murmured. "I can hear him." "No, Megan," I snapped. "It's not him. Whatever's out there, it's not your brother." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she tore free and ran into the woods. I didn't think. I just followed. The trees seemed to close in as I ran, their branches clawing at my arms and face. The ground beneath me felt uneven, shifting with every step. And then I saw her, a figure in the distance, illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't Megan. It was him, the ranger I'd lost. He stood there, just as I remembered him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and clean. But his eyes were hollow, his expression blank. "Sam," he said, his voice soft. "Why did you leave me?" My chest tightened. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "You're not—" He stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "Why didn't you save me?" "I couldn't," I shouted, the words tearing from my throat. I tried, but I couldn't." The glow around him flickered, and for a brief moment I saw the truth. His form twisted, stretched, his face elongating into a grotesque mask. Then he lunged. I fell backward, scrambling to my feet just as the creature disappeared into the shadows. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the woods, calling for Megan. The valley shifted around me, the trees warping into unfamiliar shapes. The hum returned, louder now, joined by whispers and a dozen different voices. They called my name, each one a cruel mockery of someone I'd known. "Sam." Megan's voice cut through the noise, distant but unmistakable. I ran toward it, breaking through the trees into a small clearing. Megan stood in the center, staring at something I couldn't see. "Megan!" I shouted. She didn't move. I approached slowly, and that's when I saw it. A creature crouched in the shadows, its emaciated form barely visible in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly, locked onto Megan. "It's not real," I said, grabbing her arm. "Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." She blinked, her gaze shifting to me. For a moment, she looked like she might believe me. But then the creature shifted and she screamed. The creature lunged, its form twisting and elongating as it closed the distance between us. I shoved Megan behind me, grabbing the knife from my belt. The blade was small, but it was all I had. The creature hesitated, its hollow eyes narrowing. It spoke then, its voice a sickening blend of the whispers I'd heard all night. "Give her to me," it said, its tone almost gentle, "and I'll let you leave." "Not a chance," I growled, tightening my grip on the knife. The creature's form shifted again, its antler-like protrusions scraping against the trees as it rose to its full height. "Then you will stay. Forever." I don't remember much of the fight, just flashes of movement, the sound of Megan screaming, and the weight of the creature's claws as they raked across my shoulder. Somehow I managed to drive the knife into its side, and the valley erupted with an ear-splitting wail. The creature recoiled, its form dissolving into shadows. I grabbed Megan's hand and ran, not stopping until we burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the RV waited. The drive out of Shadow Valley was silent. Megan sat in the passenger seat, clutching her duffel bag like a lifeline. I didn't ask what she'd seen, and she didn't offer. As the sun rose, the valley faded into the distance, but the weight in my chest remained. I'd escaped, but I knew the hunger wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, and I wasn't sure if I'd left it behind or if it had followed me. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to come to this cursed place with its twisted trees and air so still it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. But my brother Trevor had insisted. His big history teacher brain couldn't resist the allure of Devil's Hollow. According to him, it was a critical piece of Pennsylvania folklore and a must-see before we all move on with our lives. Yeah, well, folklore could stay in books as far as I was concerned, but Trevor could be stubborn, and Ryan, his best friend, loved teasing me when I got spooked. My best friend, Mia, was no better. She had packed her cameras and drone like this was just another Instagram-worthy trip. So, here we were, 4 mismatched adventurers in a creaky old RV, bumping down a dirt road into the middle of nowhere. The first thing that went wrong was the generator. We'd barely parked the RV at a clearing when the lights flickered and died. Ryan muttered curses as he clanged around in the storage compartment trying to fix it, but his usual confidence had started to waver. Trevor tried to reassure us by pulling out his flashlight, but it flickered and sputtered after only a few minutes. Mia laughed nervously, holding up her phone flashlight like that would do much good against the oppressive dark of Devil's Hollow. Then there were the carvings. We found them while hiking, etched deep into the bark of an ancient oak tree. Strange, looping symbols spiraled across its surface, like a language I couldn't read but somehow felt in my bones. Trevor crouched down, tracing the marks with his fingers. "They're protection sigils," he said, his voice too eager. "Local settlers carved these to ward off witches. Fascinating." "Yeah, fascinating," Ryan said, rolling his eyes. "Let's not mess with it." But of course, Trevor couldn't help himself. As he studied the tree, part of the bark crumbled away under his touch, breaking one of the spirals in half. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and I thought I heard a faint whisper. Just a trick of the wind, I told myself. By the time we got back to the RV, tensions were already running high. Trevor and Ryan were bickering. Mia kept complaining about her drone losing signal, and I felt the creeping unease of being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves. But that night, things got worse. The fire had been comforting for a while, crackling softly as we sat around it. Ryan had a flask of whiskey he kept passing around, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like a normal camping trip. Then the fire went out. It didn't sputter or die down naturally. It just went out, as if snuffed by an unseen hand. Darkness rushed in like a wave, and suddenly we were sitting there, blind and exposed. Ryan cursed again, fumbling for his flashlight, but the batteries had died. Trevor's flashlight wouldn't turn on either, and Mia's phone flickered before dying completely. Panic started to set in. Then we heard it. Whispers. They drifted through the trees, too faint to make out, but unmistakably human. Or at least, that's what they sounded like. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Trevor stood, squinting into the darkness. Probably just wind. Or animals. "That's not the wind," I said. I wasn't sure how I knew, but I did. Something was out there, circling us just beyond the firelight that no longer existed. The first shadow appeared a few minutes later. It was subtle at first, a vague shape flitting between the trees, almost indistinguishable from the darkness. Then it moved again, closer this time, and I could see its humanoid form. Too tall, too thin, and wrong in the ways I couldn't articulate. Ryan saw it too. "Did you see that?" he hissed, grabbing a stick from the dead fire. "Something's out there." Trevor waved him off. "It's nothing. Probably a deer." "Does a deer walk upright?" Ryan shot back. Mia whimpered beside me. She was clutching her camera like it was some kind of talisman, though it had long since stopped working. "We need to leave," she said, her voice cracking. "Now." But Trevor, ever the scholar, was determined to stay. "This is exactly why people come to Devil's Hollow," he said, "to experience this kind of phenomenon. It's fascinating." "It's dangerous," I snapped. "We're not equipped to deal with this." As if in response, the shadow moved again, darting between the trees with unnatural speed. It wasn't alone this time. More figures emerged, their shapes shifting and flickering like they couldn't quite hold together. And then came the chanting. It started low, a guttural hum that vibrated in my chest. The words were unintelligible, ancient, but their intent was clear. We weren't welcome here. Mia screamed, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the RV. "Everyone inside!" I shouted. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He shoved Trevor ahead of him, and we scrambled into the RV, slamming the door behind us. The vehicle offered little comfort, its flimsy walls barely a barrier between us and whatever was out there. The RV shook violently, like something or someone was trying to tip it over. Claw marks appeared on the windows, long and jagged, and the chanting grew louder, filling every corner of the small space. Trevor sat frozen, his face pale as death, while Mia sobbed quietly. Ryan gripped a tire iron, ready to fight whatever came through the door. And then Trevor spoke. At first, his voice was low, almost a whisper. But as the words spilled out, they grew louder, harsher, echoing the chant outside. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his body convulsed. "Trevor, stop!" I shouted, shaking him, but he didn't respond. His lips moved faster, the ancient words pouring out like a torrent. "What the hell is happening to him?" Ryan demanded. "It's the witch," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "She's in him." The chanting outside stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse. The shadows pressed against the windows, their forms solidifying into humanoid figures with two long limbs and eyeless faces. One of them pressed its hand, if you could call it that, against the glass, and I swear I heard it laugh. We couldn't stay. "We have to finish this," I said, my voice shaking. "Trevor said those symbols were protection sigils. We need to fix the one we broke." Ryan stared at me like I was crazy. "You want us to go back out there?" "Do you have a better idea?" I shot back. He didn't. It was a desperate, reckless plan, but we had no other options. Mia stayed behind to watch over Trevor, who had gone unnervingly still, while Ryan and I ventured back into the woods with what little supplies we had. A flashlight that barely worked, a piece of chalk, and a knife for protection, though I doubted it would do much good. The forest felt alive as we moved through it, the trees twisting and groaning as if trying to block our path. The shadows followed us, their laughter growing louder with every step. When we reached the tree with the broken sigil, I didn't hesitate. I drew the missing lines as best I could, my hands trembling. But the chalk wasn't enough. The sigil required blood. Without thinking, I pressed the knife to my palm and sliced. Blood dripped onto the bark, and the air around us seemed to shatter like glass. The chanting returned, deafening now, and the shadows surged forward. Ryan fought them off as best he could, swinging the knife wildly. I don't know if it hurt them or just slowed them down, but it gave me enough time to finish the sigil. As I connected the final line, a blinding light erupted from the tree, forcing the shadows to retreat. But it wasn't over. The witch appeared then, her form more solid than the shadows, her face twisted with rage. She lunged at us, her clawed hands reaching for my throat. Ryan shoved me aside, taking the full force of her attack. I heard him scream as she dragged him into the darkness, and then he was gone. When I stumbled back to the RV, Mia was sobbing over Trevor's body. He wasn't breathing. Whatever the witch had done to him, it had left him hollow, like the life had been sucked out of him. The sigil had worked. The witch was gone, but the cost had been too high. We left Devil's Hollow at dawn, the RV limping down the dirt road like a wounded animal. Mia hasn't spoken since. I can't get Ryan's screams out of my head. And Trevor's gone. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear him chanting. and I wonder if the witch is truly gone, or if she left a part of herself behind. I parked my RV at the Devil's Hole trailhead just after noon, the golden light of early autumn filtering through the canopy of trees. The parking lot was empty except for a ranger truck with Park Services stenciled on the side. A few miles of solitude in these woods would be just what I needed. Just me, my camera, and a trail I'd never walked before. The falls were supposed to be stunning this time of year, and if the name Devil's Hole didn't scare me off, nothing would. As I stepped out, the crisp air prickled my skin, a perfect balance of warm sunlight and cool shadows. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed with essentials, and locked the RV behind me. The trailhead sign was faded but clear enough. Devil's Hole Trail 3 miles to Falls. Here goes nothing, I muttered. I hadn't made it 10 feet before a voice called out. "You're not planning to hike that alone, are you?" I turned to see a man leaning against the ranger truck, arms crossed. He wore the uniform well, brown shirt, green pants, and a wide-brimmed hat, but his easy smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've hiked solo plenty of times," I said, hoisting my bag higher. "Why?" His smile faltered. "Devil's Hole isn't like other trails. People get lost out there, or worse. Is this your way of warning me off?" "It's my way of saying stick to the main trail. Don't go exploring any side paths, especially not near the ravine." I shrugged, brushing past him. "Thanks for the tip." The first mile was uneventful, the trail winding gently uphill through dense forest. Sunlight dappled the ground, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. Every so often, I stopped to snap photos of the trees or a particularly gnarled root system. The farther I went, though, the quieter it got. The cheerful rustle of birds and squirrels faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness. By the time I reached the 2nd-mile marker, the silence was suffocating. The trail narrowed here, flanked by steep drops on one side and dense thickets on the other. A faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around my boots with every step. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, just barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Mia." I froze, gripping my camera like a lifeline. The voice had come from the trees, soft and beckoning. But it couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. "Mia, come here." My throat tightened. It wasn't just a voice, it was my mother's voice. She'd died 3 years ago, and yet there it was, clear as day, calling my name from the woods. "Get it together," I whispered to myself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." Shaking it off, I pressed on, quickening my pace. The ravine came into view just ahead, a jagged scar in the earth that dropped sharply into darkness. The air here was colder, the mist thicker. I took a hesitant step closer, peering down into the void. "You don't want to go any farther." The voice startled me, and I whirled to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was young, her hair a messy tangle, her clothes wrinkled and muddy. Her wide, haunted eyes locked on mine. "Who are you?" I asked. "Leah," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm looking for my boyfriend. He disappeared near here." I glanced around, but the trail was empty. "How long has he been missing?" 2 days, she said. "We were hiking together, but he took a wrong turn near the ravine. I thought he'd just gone ahead, but I never found him." Her story sent a shiver down my spine. The ranger's warning suddenly felt more like a prophecy than a precaution. Have you called for help? I did, but they didn't find anything. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the ravine. But I know he's down there. I hear him calling me sometimes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What do you mean? Her voice dropped to a whisper. At night, I hear him. He says my name. He says he's waiting for me. I tried to convince Leah to come back to the trailhead with me, but she refused. I'm not leaving without him, she said firmly. Reluctantly, I agreed to help her search, though every instinct screamed at me to get the hell out of there. We followed the trail along the edge of the ravine, scanning the ground for any sign of her boyfriend. The air grew heavier the farther we went, the mist thickening until it felt like we were walking through a dream. Leah didn't say much, but every so often she'd glance into the ravine, her face tight with something like fear or longing. It wasn't until we reached a narrow section of the trail that I noticed something strange. My compass, a reliable tool I'd used on countless hikes, was spinning wildly. I tapped it, shook it, but it wouldn't settle. Something's wrong, I said, holding it up for Leah to see. She barely glanced at it. We're close, she murmured. Close to what? Before she could answer, a sound stopped us both in our tracks, a low, guttural growl coming from the ravine. Slowly, we turned toward the sound. Shapes moved in the mist below, shadowy figures that flickered in and out of focus. They were tall and angular, their limbs too long, their movements too jerky. One of them looked up, its face pale and featureless, like a blank canvas. Leah's breathing quickened. He's here, she whispered, stepping closer to the edge. Leah, no. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. That's not your boyfriend. It's him, she screamed, her voice echoing through the ravine. She tore away from me, her eyes wild. The figures surged upward, their shapes solidifying as they climbed. They moved impossibly fast, their blank faces twisting into grotesque smiles. One reached the edge, its bony hand clawing at the dirt. Run, I said, my voice barely more than a breath. We sprinted back the way we'd come, the mist parting like a living thing. The figures gave chase, their laughter echoing in the trees, a sound like dry leaves scraping across stone. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. Leah was just ahead, her silhouette barely visible through the fog. Mia, she called, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, distorted, almost inhuman. I stumbled, nearly falling as a hand brushed my shoulder. When I turned, one of the figures loomed behind me, its eyes empty pits of darkness. I lashed out with my hiking pole, and the figure dissolved into smoke, only to reform a few feet away. Up ahead, Leah had stopped, standing at the edge of the ravine. Her arms were outstretched, as if she were welcoming the creatures. Leah! I shouted, but she didn't turn. They're not monsters, she said softly. They're angels. They're here to take me to him. I ran to her, grabbing her arm. They're not angels. They're... She turned to face me, and my words died in my throat. Her eyes were pitch black, her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. You should come too, she said. It's so beautiful down there. I don't remember much of what happened next, just the sound of the creatures closing in, Leah's laughter turning into a low, guttural growl, and my own screams as I ran blindly through the forest. Somehow I made it back to the trailhead, though the sun was already setting. The ranger's truck was gone, and my RV was covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. I didn't stop to think. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and leaves. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Leah was standing at the trailhead, her black eyes glowing in the fading light. She raised a hand, waving slowly, as her voice echoed in my mind. Come back. I never posted the photos from that trip. Most of them were blank, the images wiped as if they'd never been taken. The ones that remained showed nothing unusual, just misty trees and empty trails. But in the last photo, one I didn't remember taking, there was a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the ravine. Its face was featureless, but its eyes burned like coal, and its smile was meant just for me. Laurel Run was as lonely as I expected. The RV rumbled up the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the humid air. The forest pressed close on either side, a tangle of ancient trees with gnarled branches that reached for the sky like skeletal fingers. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, scanning for the turnoff Alex had marked on the map. "This place gives me the creeps," Alex muttered from the passenger seat. He had his phone out, scrolling through articles about the area's history. "Did you know there was a mine collapse here in 1886? Killed, 30 people. Some of their bodies were never recovered." "Lovely," I said flatly. "Is that supposed to make me feel better about this trip?" Alex laughed, though it sounded forced. "Just thought you'd want to know what we're camping on top of." I didn't answer. It had been Alex's idea to join me on this trip, though I'd made it clear I didn't want company. I'd come to Laurel Run to escape the noise, to lose myself in the woods and leave the guilt behind. But Alex had insisted, saying we hadn't seen each other in years and needed to reconnect. I couldn't tell him no, even if I wanted to. "There it is," he said, pointing to a narrow track branching off the main road. "Our home for the weekend." I turned the RV onto the path, wincing as the tires groaned over uneven ground. After a few minutes, we reached a clearing surrounded by dense trees. It was quiet, eerily so. Not even the birds were singing. "This is the spot," Alex said, hopping out of the RV. "Perfect, right?" I killed the engine and stepped out, the humid air hitting me like a wet blanket. "Sure," I muttered, grabbing my bag. "Perfect." We set up camp quickly, unloading chairs, a portable grill, and a cooler of food. The RV was old but functional, with just enough space for two people to sleep without bumping elbows. I planned to use it as little as possible, preferring the open air of the forest. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Alex was messing with his phone, trying to get a signal while I wandered to the edge of the trees. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the footprints, small and delicate, like those of a child. They crisscrossed the soft dirt. They led from the tree line to the clearing, circling our campsite before vanishing into the woods. "Alex," I called, keeping my voice calm. "Come, look at this." He appeared at my side, squinting at the ground. "Are those kids' footprints?" "Looks like it," I said, "but they don't lead anywhere." Alex frowned. "Maybe it's a local kid playing around." "Out here?" I gestured to the thick forest. "There's nothing for miles." He didn't have an answer. We both stood there, staring at the footprints until a distant roll of thunder broke the silence. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the air grew heavier with the promise of rain. "Let's get inside," I said, turning back to the RV. The storm hit hard, rain lashing against the windows as lightning lit up the sky. Inside, Alex was scrolling through his phone again, muttering about the weird history of the area. I sat across from him, pretending to read a book, but my mind was elsewhere. "Hey," Alex said suddenly, his voice low, "listen to this. Some of the miners' kids used to play near the mine shafts while their dads were working. After the collapse, people started seeing a little girl wander in the woods. They called her the Black-Eyed Girl." "Why?" I asked, not looking up. "They said her eyes were wrong, too dark, like they weren't human." I rolled my eyes. "Sounds like a campfire story." "Maybe," Alex said, "but it's kinda creepy, right? I mean, we're basically on top of that mine." Before I could respond, a loud knock came from the RV door. We both froze. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. Slowly, I stood and moved to the door, peering through the small window. A figure stood just outside, barely visible in the dim light. It was a child, a girl, no older than 7, with tangled hair and a filthy dress. "What the hell?" I muttered, unlocking the door. The girl looked up at me with wide eyes, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "I'm lost," she said, her voice trembling. "Can you help me?" I hesitated, glancing back at Alex, who was staring at the girl like she'd appeared out of thin air. "Where are your parents?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. I got lost." Something about her felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Still, I couldn't just leave her out there in the storm. "Come inside," I said, stepping back to let her in. The girl sat at the small table, clutching a blanket Alex had given her. She wouldn't meet my eyes, staring down at her muddy hands instead. "What's your name?" Alex asked gently. "Lucy," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Lucy," Alex repeated. "Do you remember where you live?" She shook her head again, her hair falling in front of her face. I leaned against the counter, watching her closely. Something about her felt wrong. Her movements were too stiff, too deliberate, like she was mimicking a child rather than being one. "Where did you come from?" I asked. She looked up at me then, and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were pitch black, like 2 pools of ink. No whites, no irises, just darkness. "From the mine," she said. The power flickered, plunging the RV into darkness. Alex cursed, fumbling for his flashlight, but I couldn't move. Lucy's eyes bored into mine, her lips curving into a faint, unsettling smile. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Alex's arm. "Now." "What are you talking about?" he asked, but I was already pulling him toward the door. Lucy didn't try to stop us. She just sat there, her smile widening as we stumbled outside into the rain. The forest was pitch black, the storm raging around us, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying in that RV. "Clara, what the hell is going on?" Alex shouted over the thunder. "She's not human," I said, my voice shaking. "Did you see her eyes? Did you see them?" Alex opened his mouth to argue, but a sound stopped him. It was a low, guttural growl coming from the woods. Slowly, we turned toward the sound. Shapes moved in the shadows, barely visible in the flashes of lightning. They were tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces pale and featureless. They moved closer, circling us, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted through the forest, the mud sucking at our boots as the shapes closed in. The growls grew louder, joined by whispers that sounded like children's voices. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't stop. We stumbled into a clearing, panting and soaked to the bone. The whispers had stopped, but the forest was still alive with an unnatural energy. "Where are we?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. My flashlight beam caught something ahead, a jagged opening in the ground framed by rusted beams. The mine. "We're not going in there," Alex said, backing away. "We don't have a choice," I said, grabbing his arm. "It's the only place they won't follow." "How do you know that?" "I don't," I admitted. "But do you want to stay out here?" Reluctantly, he followed me into the mine. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of rot. Our flashlights illuminated the narrow tunnel, the walls covered in black soot. The ground was littered with rusted tools and broken beams, remnants of the mine's tragic history. As we moved deeper, the whispers returned, echoing off the walls. They sounded like children laughing, but there was no joy in the sound, only malice. "Clara," Alex said, his voice shaken, "we need to get out of here." Before I could respond, the ground trembled and a deafening roar filled the tunnel. Rocks fell around us, blocking the entrance. We were trapped. Then I saw her. Lucy stood at the end of the tunnel, her black eyes glowing in the darkness. She wasn't alone. The shadowy figures from the forest stood behind her, their featureless faces watching us silently. "You shouldn't have come here," Lucy said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "To play," she said, smiling again. "Forever." I don't remember much of what happened next. Just the sound of Alex screaming, the walls closing in, and Lucy's laughter echoing in my head. Somehow I managed to claw my way out of the mine, dragging Alex with me. We stumbled back to the RV, battered and... The road to Moonshine Church was little more than a winding dirt path, carved through the shadowy woods of Fayette County. The RV rattled and groaned as we bounced over every rock and rut, its old shocks protesting loudly. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, squinting through the gathering fog. "This is the last time I let you pick the spot, Riley," I muttered. My voice came out sharper than intended, but I was too tired to care. From the passenger seat, Riley looked up from her tattered map. "Come on, Clara. You can't deny it has charm. A haunted church surrounded by a creepy forest. Perfect for the vlog." Elliot, slouched in the back, snorted. "Yeah, perfect if you want to get murdered in the middle of nowhere. I'm just saying, we could have gone to Ohiopyle or somewhere with, I don't know, running water." "Where's your sense of adventure?" Riley asked, flashing him a grin. "I left it back home with my warm bed," Elliot shot back. I sighed, keeping my eyes on the road. The truth was, I wasn't thrilled about this trip either, but Riley had been relentless. She'd grown up near these woods and had always wanted to investigate the legends surrounding Moonshine Church. I agreed to come partly out of curiosity, and partly because I was desperate for content for my survival vlog. Ghost stories weren't exactly my thing, but they drew an audience. The church came into view as we rounded a bend, a crumbling, blackened structure sitting in the middle of an overgrown clearing. Its roof sagged in places, and the boarded-up windows gave it the appearance of a hollow skull. A small cemetery stretched out behind it, gravestones leaning like drunks in the mist. "This is it," Riley whispered, almost reverently. I parked the RV at the edge of the clearing, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Even the birds had gone quiet. "Home, sweet home," I said, forcing a cheerfulness I didn't feel. We spent the first hour setting up camp. The RV had seen better days, but it was functional, mostly. The heater sputtered to life after a few tries, and the portable generator hummed softly outside. Riley insisted on exploring the church immediately, so Elliot and I reluctantly followed her to the dilapidated building. The air around the church felt wrong, heavier somehow. The closer we got, the colder it became, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter. "Look at this," Riley said, crouching near the entrance. She traced her fingers over strange symbols carved into the rotting wood. They looked like crude spirals and jagged lines, but something about them made my stomach turn. "What do they mean?" I asked. "No idea," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "But they look old. Protective, maybe?" "Protective from what?" Elliot asked, uneasily scanning the tree line. Riley didn't answer. Instead, she led us inside. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty space. I shined my flashlight around, the beam illuminating broken pews and a pulpit covered in graffiti. More of those strange symbols were scrawled on the walls, some fresh, others faded with time. "This place is a dump," Elliot said, kicking at a pile of debris. "It's history," Riley corrected, pulling out her spirit box. The device crackled to life, filling the silence with static. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. "That thing's just gonna pick up radio signals." "Humor me," Riley said, adjusting the dials. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked. For a long moment, the static was the only response. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. "Turn back." We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Riley whispered, her face pale. "It's just interference," I said quickly, though my pulse was racing. Elliot wasn't convinced. "Let's get out of here," he said, heading for the door. I followed, dragging Riley with me. Whatever fun this had started as, it wasn't fun anymore. That night, the unease settled in like an unwelcome guest. The RV was warm enough, but the air felt stifling. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the forest whole. Even with the windows closed, I could swear I heard faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. Elliot was already in bed, but Riley was still fiddling with her spirit box. I glared at her from across the tiny table. "Can you not?" She didn't look up. "It's just noise, Clara. Don't tell me you're spooked." "I'm not spooked," I snapped, though it wasn't entirely true. "I just don't want you drawing attention to us." "From what?" she asked, but I didn't answer. That night, I dreamed of shadows. They slithered through the trees, long-limbed and wrong, their faces shifting like ripples in water. One of them stopped at the RV, pressing a clawed hand to the window. When it looked at me, I woke with a gasp. The next morning, things got worse. Elliot discovered scratches on the side of the RV, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there the night before. "A bear?" he guessed, though he didn't sound convinced. I frowned. No tracks. Whatever it wasn't an animal. Riley was quiet, unusually so. She hadn't mentioned the spirit box since the church, but I noticed her glancing at it nervously, as if it might come to life on its own. We spent the day trying to act normal. Riley and I filmed some survival tips around the clearing, but my heart wasn't in it. Elliot stayed near the RV, muttering about bad vibes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog had returned, thicker than ever. It started with the voices. I was outside, refueling the generator, when I heard it, a faint call from the forest. "Clara!" I froze. The voice was familiar, achingly so. It sounded like my brother, Michael. He'd been dead for 10 years, and yet there it was again, calling my name. "Clara, help me." I stumbled back toward the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaken. "Hear what?" Riley asked, though her wide eyes told me she had. "Someone's out there," I said, pacing. "Someone's messing with us." Elliot scoffed. "Messing with us? Out here? No one's that bored." Before I could respond, the RV lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Riley screamed, fumbling for her flashlight. When the light came back on, we all stared at the door. Scratches, fresh ones, etched deep into the metal. "Okay, that's it. We're leaving," Elliot said, grabbing his coat. "We can't leave in this fog," I said. "We'll drive off the road." "Better than staying here," he snapped, his voice rising. "You've seen the same stuff I have. Something's out there, and it's not going to stop." Suddenly, we heard his voice. "Elliot." It came from the forest, distant but clear. His face went pale. "That's my mom." "No, it isn't," I said, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off. "I know my mom's voice," he shouted, throwing the door open and storming outside. Riley and I ran after him, but the fog swallowed him whole. "Elliot!" I screamed, my voice echoing uselessly. Then came the scream, raw, guttural, and inhuman. Riley grabbed my hand, dragging me back to the RV. We locked the door and huddled together, waiting for dawn. We didn't sleep. The scratching returned, more insistent this time, accompanied by low, guttural growls. At one point, I saw a face pressed against the window, elongated, distorted, and grinning. "It's a skinwalker," Riley whispered. Her voice trembled as she recited a Navajo legend about shapeshifters that preyed on humans, mimicking their voices to lure them into the woods. "Why would it be here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's hungry." When dawn finally broke, the fog lifted, revealing the forest in its cold, gray reality. Elliot was gone. The RV was in shambles, claw marks marring every surface. We didn't speak as we gathered what little we could carry and set off down the road on foot. As we walked, I glanced back at the church one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall and impossibly thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Then it smiled. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods. I don't know what took Elliot or how we escaped, but I do know one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it's still out there, and it's waiting. There's something about desperation that makes a man do stupid things. I'd like to think I was better than that I could stare rock bottom in the face and walk away with my dignity. But when Ryan suggested this trip, this ridiculous half-baked camping trip to Devil's Hole, I didn't even hesitate. "It'll be good for you, Jack," he'd said, slapping me on the back as we loaded my beat-up RV with supplies. "Fresh air, some beers by the fire, and maybe you'll figure out your next move." My ex-wife Evie had agreed to come, though I still don't know why. Maybe she thought it would be our swan song, a way to close the chapter on the wreckage of our marriage. Or maybe she felt sorry for me. Either way, the three of us piled into the RV and headed for the Poconos. The first sign that something was off came on the second day. We'd parked the RV near a trailhead that led to Devil's Hole. Ryan had been talking about the place non-stop, spinning tales about eerie disappearances and devilish deals like he was narrating a campfire story. "It's just a legend," I muttered as I adjusted the generator. The damn thing had been acting up since we arrived, sputtering and groaning like it was on its last legs. Evie crossed her arms, leaning against the side of the RV. "You sure this isn't a waste of time?" "It's not a waste if it gets Jack out of his head," Ryan called from inside, where he was rummaging through the cooler. "Besides, it's not every day you get to see the Devil's Clearing." I wanted to tell him to shut up, but the truth was, I was curious. Not about the devil, but about the possibility of something, anything, that could fix my life. I'd lost my job 6 months ago, burned through my savings, and pushed away the only person who'd ever really cared about me. If the devil really did hang out in these woods, maybe he'd have a solution. The hike to the clearing was brutal. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the kind of path that seemed more like an animal track than something meant for humans. Ryan led the way, his usual bravado dimmed by the oppressive quiet of the forest. "I thought there'd be birds or something," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "This place is dead." "Maybe they know better than to stick around," Evie muttered. She'd been quiet most of the trip, and I couldn't tell if it was anger or regret keeping her mouth shut. We reached the clearing just as the sun dipped below the trees, casting the meadow in long shadows. It was larger than I'd expected, a perfect circle surrounded by towering pines. The air felt different here, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. "Well," Ryan said, clapping his hands, "here we are, the Devil's Clearing." At first, it was just a clearing, eerie but unremarkable. Ryan wandered toward the center, kicking at the dirt. Evie hung back, arms wrapped around herself as if the cold was getting to her. I stood at the edge, scanning the trees for something. I wasn't sure what. Then he appeared. I didn't see him step out of the woods. One moment the clearing was empty, and the next he was there. A tall man in a weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat, leaning casually on a walking stick. His face was sharp and angular, with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Jack," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I've been expecting you." Ryan froze mid-step, his head whipping toward the man. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger ignored him, his gaze fixed on me. "You've been searching for answers, haven't you? For a way out of the mess you've made?" My mouth went dry. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but something in his eyes told me he already knew. "Okay, who hired you?" Evie said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling. "This is a joke, right?" The man smiled, a slow, unnerving curl of his lips. "No joke, no tricks, just a simple offer." He didn't move, but suddenly he was closer, standing only a few feet from me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. What do you want?" I stammered. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what you want. Your job, your money, your wife's love. I can give it all back to you." Ryan stepped between us, his hands raised. "Okay, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave." The man tilted his head, studying Ryan with mild amusement. "This isn't your concern," he said, and Ryan staggered back as if he'd been struck. "What's the price?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His grin widened. "Just a favor, nothing more. When the time comes, you'll repay me." Evie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't listen to him, Jack. This is insane." "Is it?" I snapped. "What if he can fix everything?" Ryan shook his head. "You don't even know what he's asking for. A favor? That could mean anything." I turned back to the man, desperation clawing at my chest. "What kind of favor?" "That depends on you," he said, his tone light, almost playful. "But I promise, it won't cost you more than you're willing to give." The air around us grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the last traces of sunlight faded. Evie's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear the fear in her voice as she whispered, "Jack, please, let's just go." But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the man's eyes, dark and endless, pulling me in. He extended his hand, the offer tangible and terrifying. My mind raced. What if he was telling the truth? What if this was my chance to fix everything I'd broken? Before I could answer, Ryan lunged forward, shoving me out of the way. "Enough of this," he shouted. "We're leaving." The man's smile faded. His hand dropped to his side, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. "I'm afraid it's too late for that," he said. The clearing erupted in chaos. The earth split open, cracks snaking through the dirt as a deafening roar filled the air. Ryan stumbled, falling to his knees. Evie screamed, reaching for me, but the man stepped between us, his form growing taller, darker, more monstrous. I grabbed Evie's hand, pulling her back as the ground crumbled beneath Ryan. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "Jack!" he shouted, but I couldn't reach him. The chasm swallowed him whole, and the clearing went still. The man, the stranger, turned to me, his face now a mask of shadow and flame. "The choice has been made," he said, "and the debt will be collected." The weight of his words crushed me, but before I could respond, he vanished, leaving only silence. We found our way back to the RV, though I couldn't tell you how. The trail that had seemed so clear before was now a confusing maze, but somehow we emerged from the woods, battered and broken. Evie didn't speak to me as we drove away, her face pale and tear-streaked. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the clearing, now empty and quiet. But I knew it wasn't over. The mark on my palm, burned into my skin, told me the stranger wasn't done with me. And deep down, I knew I'd see him again. There's a strange pull to places like Laurel Run, places steeped in whispers and half-forgotten history. When I decided to take my RV out for a trip with Sam, my 10-year-old son, I thought it would be the perfect mix of adventure and work. The woods were rich with eerie folklore, and my blog thrived on that sort of thing. Stories about the ghost boy of Laurel Run would be a gold mine. Sam was thrilled when I told him. He loved anything spooky, though I figured he'd be more interested in climbing rocks and poking at bugs than hunting ghosts. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, the winding roads giving way to dense woods that seemed darker than they should have been. When we finally parked the RV in a clearing near an old trail, Sam bolted out the door, his boundless energy putting me to shame. I called after him. "Stay close. I mean it, Sam." Yeah, he shouted back, already chasing after a squirrel. I sighed, grabbing my camera bag. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the stillness was eerie. It was as if the forest were holding its breath. By the time we met Karen, I was already second-guessing my decision. The RV's generator had sputtered out once, forcing me to tinker with it while Sam wandered too close to the trees for my liking. When Karen appeared on the path, her wide-brimmed hat and weathered backpack made her look like she'd stepped out of another time. "You must be Nina," she said, smiling. "I saw your post in the travel forum." "Guilty," I replied, shaking her hand. "And you're Karen?" She nodded, her face turning serious. "You're camped near Laurel Run, aren't you? I hope you're not planning to go too far off the trails." Her warning was clear, but I brushed it off. "I'm just here to write about the folklore. People love a good ghost story." Karen hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There's truth to those stories, you know. That boy, he doesn't like to be disturbed." "Ghosts don't bother me," I said lightly. "And besides, Sam's the one who wants to go looking for him, not me." At the mention of Sam, Karen's expression darkened. "Be careful with him," she said softly. "The boy doesn't just haunt. Sometimes he takes." That night, after a dinner of hot dogs and marshmallows, Sam sat cross-legged on his bed in the RV, staring out the window. "Do you think I'll see him?" he asked. "See who?" I replied, pretending not to know. "The ghost boy," Sam said. His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was asking about the weather. "Karen said he used to live here, right, before the mine collapsed?" I frowned. "Karen talks too much. Go to sleep, Sam." He didn't argue, but when I turned off the lights, I caught him still staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the hum of the generator or the creaks of the RV settling. It was softer, rhythmic, like footsteps. They circled the RV, pausing near the door. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the window. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the sound, but the light revealed nothing except the fogged glass. Swallowing my fear, I checked on Sam. He was fast asleep, his small frame curled under the blanket. In the morning, I found footprints around the RV, child-sized ones leading from the forest and stopping near the door. I told myself it was nothing, just some prank or a wandering animal. Sam didn't mention anything strange, so I let it go. The next day, we explored the ruins. The remnants of the mining town were haunting, crumbling stone foundations overtaken by moss, rusted equipment sinking into the earth like forgotten relics. Sam was full of questions, darting from one ruin to the next, while I took photos and jotted notes for my blog. We found the mine entrance just as the sun began dipping low. It was boarded up, but the boards were splintered and worn, as if someone, or something, had tried to pry them loose. Sam stood staring at it, his expression unreadable. "Let's go," I said, tugging his arm. "It's not safe." As we turned back toward the RV, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted between the trees, quick and fluid. My breath hitched, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. That night, Sam began acting strange. He insisted he'd made a new friend, a boy he'd met in the woods. When I asked him to describe the boy, he shrugged. "He's nice," he said. "He asked me to help him find something." "Sam, you know better than to wander off," I scolded, but his expression didn't change. He was distracted, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I finally got him to bed, I heard the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. They sounded like a child's voice, repeating my name over and over. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, filling the RV. I clapped my hands over my ears, panic clawing at my chest. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. The next day was worse. Sam vanished while I was photographing an old mining cart. One moment, he was beside me. The next, he was gone. My calls echoed through the forest, unanswered. When I finally found him, he was standing at the edge of the mine entrance, his small hands resting on the splintered boards. "Sam!" I shouted, yanking him back. "What are you doing?" "He's in there," Sam said, his voice eerily calm. "He wants his box." "What box?" I demanded, shaking him slightly. Sam didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the dark opening of the mine. Karen found us an hour later, her face lined with worry. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice trembling. "He's chosen your boy." "What does that mean?" I snapped, my panic bubbling over. Karen explained the legend in halting whispers. "The ghost boy," she said, "was trapped here, searching for the tin box he'd carried when he died. It held his most precious possessions, a small toy and a letter to his mother. Until the box was found, he couldn't move on." "I'm not leaving without Sam," I said, my voice firm. Karen nodded grimly. "Then you'll have to face him." The storm hit as we approached the mine. Rain lashed at us and the wind howled, but I refused to turn back. Sam led the way, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Karen and I followed, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the mine, the air was cold and heavy. The walls dripped with moisture and the floor was slick with mud. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became. Then we saw him. The ghost boy stood in the dim light, his translucent form shimmering. His eyes were wide and pleading, and he raised a hand pointing to a pile of rubble. Sam stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm, holding him back. Karen knelt beside the rubble, digging with her bare hands. The boy watched silently, his expression a mix of hope and sorrow. When Karen unearthed the tin box, the boy's form flickered, his mouth forming a wordless, "Thank you." The mine began to shake, the walls groaning as if in protest. Rocks fell around us and I grabbed Sam, dragging him toward the entrance. Karen was close behind, clutching the box. The ghost boy lingered, his form growing fainter. Just as the tunnel began to collapse, he raised his hand in a final farewell and vanished. We stumbled into the rain-soaked forest, gasping for air. Karen handed me the box, her hands trembling. "It's over," she said. Back in the RV, Sam clung to me, his small body shaking. I held him close, tears streaming down my face. The box sat on the table, its contents untouched. I promised myself I'd find a way to honor the boy's memory, to make sure his story wasn't forgotten. As we drove away the next morning, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the forest, the ghost boy stood watching, a faint smile on his face. Then he was gone, swallowed by the mist. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Laurel Run, but I'll never forget what I saw there, or the boy who gave everything to find peace. I never thought my love for the outdoors would lead me here, staring into the dark abyss of Bald Eagle State Forest, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But that's the thing about nature. It doesn't care if you're ready for what it hides. It was my idea to come. A weekend getaway in the RV, I'd said, brushing off the warnings from locals and skeptical glances from Tyler. I wanted to prove something to myself after the accident last year. A broken leg, 3 months of rehab, and a nagging fear that maybe I wasn't as tough as I thought. Jules, my childhood friend, jumped at the chance, and Tyler, my boyfriend, reluctantly agreed. His best friend, Max, tagged along, eager to test his new gadgets, though his sarcastic grin suggested he didn't think much of my planning. The forest swallowed us as soon as we arrived. The gravel road narrowed until it was barely more than a trail, the towering trees on either side forming a wall of shadow. Max whistled. "Cozy," he said, eyes glued to his GPS. "Looks like we're just a couple miles from Raven's Hollow. You know, where all the creepy stuff happens." "Very funny," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Jules, sitting beside me, leaned forward, her eyes wide with excitement. "Seriously, Claire, this place is famous. Witch legends, disappearances, even a guy who swore he saw some kind of monster." Tyler groaned from the back. "You brought us to a Scooby-Doo episode?" "Shut up, Tyler," Jules snapped. "It's history." "Let's just get the campsite set up," I cut in. The tension was already bubbling, and we hadn't even unpacked. The first night was uneventful. We parked the RV in a clearing and set up a small fire. Max played with his drone, Jules flipped through her folklore book, and Tyler roasted marshmallows, pretending to enjoy himself. But the forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the RV settling. I didn't mention it. Maybe I didn't want to be the first to admit I felt uneasy. We hit the trail to Raven's Hollow the next morning, Max leading with his GPS and Jules practically skipping beside him. Tyler trudged behind, muttering about blisters. The path was narrow, lined with ancient oaks whose gnarled branches twisted like fingers. The deeper we went, the darker it grew, the canopy blocking out the sun. "Anyone else feel like we're walking into a horror movie?" Max joked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Jules stopped suddenly. "Look." She pointed to a tree. Carved into the bark was a strange symbol, a circle bisected by jagged lines. "It's just graffiti," Tyler said, but Jules shook her head. "No, it's not. These are protection symbols. Pennsylvania Dutch witches use them to ward off evil." "Great," Max muttered, snapping a picture. "Let's hope they work." We reached Raven's Hollow by midday. The clearing was small, surrounded by dense underbrush. At its center stood the remnants of a stone foundation, overgrown with moss and vines. Jules lit up. "This must have been her house," she said, crouching to examine the stones. "Whose house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Whispering Witch. The story goes she cursed the forest after the townsfolk burned her alive. People say she still haunts this place, looking for revenge." "Charming," Tyler said, rolling his eyes. "Let's eat." But as we unpacked lunch, the forest seemed to close in around us. The silence grew oppressive, the kind that presses on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. Then came the smell, rank and metallic, like rotting meat. Tyler gagged. "What is that?" Jules looked pale. "It's a bad sign. We should go." We didn't argue. The walk back felt longer. Max's GPS, which had worked perfectly on the way in, started glitching, the screen flickering with static. "Awesome," he grumbled, shaking it. "Guess we're doing this old school." We trudged on, the trees seeming to shift around us, their shapes unfamiliar. I glanced at Jules, who looked nervous for the first time. "It's fine," I said, trying to reassure her. "We'll make it back." But when we returned to the RV, something was wrong. The generator, which had been humming when we left, was dead. Tyler fiddled with it while Max flew his drone, sending it over the clearing to scout the area. He frowned when it returned. The battery drained faster than usual. "Look at this," he said, showing us the footage. On the screen, just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, with long limbs and a face we couldn't make out. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching. "That's not funny," Jules said, backing away from the screen. "No one's laughing," Max replied. That night, we locked ourselves in the RV. No one wanted to admit they were scared, but the tension was palpable. Jules sat by the window, her face pale, while Tyler tried to act like nothing was wrong. Max stayed glued to his laptop, analyzing the drone footage. The first sound came around midnight, a soft tapping on the windows. Jules froze, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" We all did. Tyler peered out the window. "There's nothing out there," he said, though his voice wavered. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then came the laughter, childlike, faint, but unmistakable. My stomach twisted. "Turn off the lights," I whispered. We killed the overheads, plunging the RV into darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by whispers too faint to make out. Jules pressed her hands to her ears, rocking slightly. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real." When the generator sputtered back to life in the early hours, we decided to leave. But the forest had other plans. The GPS wouldn't connect, and the narrow roads seemed to lead us in circles. Every turn brought us back to the same clearing. The air felt heavy, suffocating. "We're trapped," Max said, his voice tinged with panic. "No, we're not," I snapped, though I didn't believe it. "We just need to stay calm." But calm was impossible when Tyler screamed. He'd wandered a few feet from the RV and fallen into a pit, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. We hauled him out, his face pale with pain. "We have to get help," I said, but Max shook his head. "Help isn't coming." It was Jules who suggested the ritual. "The symbols," she said, pointing to the trees, "they're meant to trap the witch. If we strengthen them, maybe we can break the curse." I wanted to argue, to tell her it was ridiculous, but the forest left us no choice. We followed her lead, carving the symbols deeper into the trees surrounding the clearing. As we worked, the whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Then it appeared. The figure from Max's drone stepped into the clearing, its limbs unnaturally long, its face blank but somehow filled with malice. It moved toward us in jerky, unnatural steps. Tyler, still on the ground, screamed as it crouched beside him, its head tilting as if studying him. "Keep going," Jules shouted, her hands trembling as she finished the last symbol. The figure turned to her, its mouth opening in a soundless scream. My chest tightened, fear rooting me to the spot, but Jules didn't stop. She raised her knife, carving the final line into the tree. The forest erupted in light, a blinding flash that sent the figure reeling. When it faded, the clearing was silent. The figure was gone. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Somehow the road out of the forest appeared, as if the woods had decided to let us go. Tyler's leg was broken, Max was shaken, and Jules refused to speak. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, standing at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes following us. We don't talk about what happened. Not really. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the tapping on the windows, the laughter, the whispers. And I wonder if the forest really let us go, or if it's just waiting.